How do you evaluate incoming rookies in your dynasty leagues? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast.
You are Locked On Dynasty Football, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Here are your hosts, Marcus Mosher and Kate Madjuk.
Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $150 if your bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Kate Madjuk. You can follow her on Twitter at Kate Madjuk. You can also check her out at Behind the Steel Curtain. And it's Wednesday, so of course that means it's Matt Williamson. If answering your mailbag questions, follow him on Twitter at WilliamsonNFL. We've got some really good ones today, and we're going to start with this one. It's actually one from Kate, which I think is kind of awesome that she's asking a question. How do we evaluate incoming rookies when it comes to our dynasty league? Because I do think there's a tendency to overvalue or undervalue them. So Matt, I want you to go first. How do you do it?
So a couple notes I just want to throw out there is it's so often maybe you don't love the running back, but he's a 5th round pick and he goes to a team where there's a clear starter and you think, man, he's blocked. I'm never going to get to use him. By week 6, you'll be using him. I mean, it's just guys get hurt. Running backs see the field more than you think they do in the regular season and during the dynasty, off time. Receiver, I'm going to kind of ignore, but tight end we talked about a little bit. I think it was either last week or the week before that I am very, very, very open to the idea that young tight ends are now producing like other positions, that there's not a 3-year window to wait or wait until they're age 27 when they hit their peak. I think rookie tight ends are coming in and producing for fantasy, and that's a trend that's here to stay. But what I wanted to harp on was quarterback. The more I do this, the older I get, the wiser, the more senile I get, whatever. I think landing spot is more important than the player himself almost. If you go to a bad spot, the chances of being a successful quarterback in this league, no matter how talented you are, no matter what your intangibles are almost impossible. I mean, I very much believe it takes a village to raise a quarterback, and that village is more important than the quarterback, and more often than not, in my opinion. I mean, bad coaching, bad situation, bad ownership. I'm just not investing in that guy in Dynasty.
Can you give us an example of a recent quarterback that you think best fits that sort of narrative, that if he would have landed in a better situation, we would have had ourselves a fantasy stud versus the whatever situation ensued?
One that's the opposite of what you asked was Joe Burrow, because I never had a lot of respect for Cincinnati as an organization. I thought Zach Taylor was a borderline hire at the time, but I thought he overcame a questionable situation, a team that was reluctant to spend money, and to his credit and to those around him too. I mean, getting Jamar Chase the following year had something to do with it as well. But we've seen time and time again, guys that go to Washington, for example. Like, I'm not saying Dwayne Haskins was going to be a star. I mean, I don't think he would, but there's so many instances of just quarterbacks that are swimming upstream from the start that really don't have much of a chance to succeed.
Matt, I want to ask you a question about receivers, because it's one that's really interesting to me, because I believe in the talent so much that eventually the talent's going to win out.
Yeah.
But how much do you weigh like the talent versus the landing spot?
Especially with receivers, I'm not as big a believer or worry about landing spot. That I think that most dynasty rosters, you have receivers on your team, assuming you build your team somewhat like I do and make it receiver heavy, that I don't need my rookie receiver to start for a while. And to your point, Marcus, I feel like the talent eventually is going to come to the top. Smith-Njigba is going to get his chance very, very soon. Maybe his rookie year, he wasn't super startable, but I have no less of an opinion on him or his opportunity going forward. Lockett's not going to be there forever. At that position in particular, I just want talent.
Well, I'm going to give you a guy that I'm holding out hope for, and
Okay.
Drake London, right? Like London was somebody that I love coming out of USC. The first 2 years of his career have not been great from a fantasy perspective, but because he is so talented, I think that's why you're going to see big changes at the quarterback position for the Falcons this year, because the previous 2 quarterbacks couldn't get him the ball. So if you've been willing to be a little bit patient with Drake London, I do think it's going to result in a lot of fantasy production, but it's just how long are you willing to wait on some of these receivers if you really do believe in their talent?
It's a great question, because sometimes you can be waiting too long. Like I think Terry McLaurin's a great example. Like,
yes.
He's been useful, but I think in a better situation, he would be much more useful. I mean, obviously if he was a Chief or a Bill or something like that, he'd be through the roof. I mean, I think he is that's one of my mistakes, to be honest with you. I will have guys on my team that are better football players, better prospects than they are dynasty assets, in weighing it.
London's I just got Laquan Treadwell this week, so I get it.
Wow. But no, I stick with those guys to a fault almost, just thinking that the league is so fluid. London's a perfect example. I think he's a huge buy right now. I frankly don't care if it's Arthur Smith or not. I just want a quarterback that can complete passes in Atlanta.
I will say wide receiver is the position for me that I am the most patient with out of all of these situational things. I think the running back position is so situational. Like you said, the quarterback position probably a bit more situational than most dynasty managers would want to admit, because obviously you grab onto your guys, the cream of the crop that you've evaluated, you grab on to those sort of things. But I do think that wide receiver is that position that I think ultimately, usually talent rises to the top eventually, whether that be a situation like the Atlanta Falcons, where they realize the quarterback isn't able to elevate that talent and as much talent as you have at wide receiver, if they're not able to elevate the quarterback as well, like you'll see some impatience there. And then usually sometimes the quarterback is the position that we see, turn over here a bit. And wide receiver definitely feels like that position to be most patient for when you're evaluating these guys.
Matt, I got a quick question for you. So like if we're doing this on like a sliding scale for receivers, maybe it's 90% talent, 10% situation. For running backs, is it flipped for you? Is like the situation the most important thing? Or is talent still the number one thing you're looking for in running backs?
I think situations 50-50 then. If we're doing that 90-10 scale, maybe it's 50-50 for running backs. But kind of like I opened the show, if there's just one guy ahead of you, I know we talked about Cincinnati earlier about, a couple of weeks ago, Mixon and Brown. Mixon's ahead of him. So what? I mean, he's not going to be there for long. I mean, one thing Ryan and I talked a lot about in our dynasty, sessions were almost treat running backs like it's redraft. I mean, Spears was a clear handcuff. Well, that has a lot of value. Chances of him seeing the field are really strong, or the next year it's extremely strong. So I think you should look at running backs almost like they're redraft.
I agree. Let's talk about Trevor Lawrence and his dynasty value in Superflex leagues next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Get buckets with your first bet on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That is $150 if your bet wins. Bet on all of your favorite NBA players and teams with their quick bets, the live same-game parlays, exclusive props, and so much more. You can go bet on the futures right now. You can go bet on who's going to make the play-in tournament, who's going to come out of each conference, and of course, who is going to win the NBA championship. All you have to do is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and shoot your shot with FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NBA. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We want to let you know that Locked On has launched the first ever national sports 24/7 streaming channel on YouTube. And now you can also find it on Amazon Fire TV. Locked On Sports Today is here for you 24/7, covering the top sports stories of the day with the local experts of Locked On, plus our national shows covering every league. Find the Locked On Sports Today channel now on Amazon Fire TV. All right, Matt, this next question comes from a listener on YouTube. He wants to know, should I trade Trevor Lawrence for the number 104 in a super flex league? I got to assume that at least one wide receiver is going into the top 4. Would you trade Lawrence for any one of Drake May, Jaden Daniels, or Caleb Williams?
So I think we have to start by, what is Trevor Lawrence? Let's evaluate Lawrence. And frankly, I didn't think he was a transcendent prospect, Andrew Luck level, coming out of Clemson. I thought he was an A, not an A+, and so I think he's looked at in a very difficult light. And I've heard, I forget which podcast I was listening to. I listened to a bunch, and someone said, if Trevor Lawrence has a Matt Ryan career, a lot of people will think that's disappointing, but it shouldn't be. I mean, that's a very, very good NFL career. Just 5 minutes ago, we said, it takes a village to raise a quarterback. Well, Lawrence went to a village that was on fire and then got hit by a tornado. He went to the worst village ever as a rookie. And I think he's overcome it, and the village is starting to build. I do think a lot of people look at Lawrence and say, he's a disappointment. I'm getting out. I don't see him that way. I mean, that team had a ton of drops, no running game, poor offensive line play as the season went on. I'm still convinced that in the real world, he's going to be probably a top 5 quarterback for the majority of his long career. I don't think that's ambitious at that point. I mean, I think he's going to be at the Burrow Herbert level before long as an NFL player. So I would rather have Lawrence than the 1-4. I could see a scenario where your team is loaded at quarterback that you'd trade him straight up for Harrison Jr., maybe. But I think in terms of him versus the top 3 rookie incoming quarterbacks, I'm going to be a little safe on this one and say I want Lawrence over all of them. As opposed to, we've seen, do we know any of those guys are going to be good? Are any of them going to come in the league and be comfortable right off the bat? I don't know that. And that's not a knock on the players. It's just how the league works, how the world works. I want Lawrence ahead of them right now.
Kate?
Even regardless of draft capital, I mean, we see misses inside the top 5. Obviously, draft capital does give, some credence to longevity of your career, because you are going to get probably more opportunities long term if you do have that high draft capital. But just because you're a top 5 pick or a top 10 pick does not mean that when we look back retrospectively with 2020 hindsight, you're going to have been worth that top 5, top 10 pick. So I do think I'm going to roll with Trevor Lawrence in this circumstance. I think he's safer, first of all, like you said. I think for what we've seen from Trevor Lawrence, obviously circumstances haven't always been ideal. We can throw year 1 away. Year 2 with Doug Peterson as head coach, pretty disappointing by most circumstances. I think we looked at Calvin Ridley and that kind of upside that he has as something that was going to take Trevor Lawrence into this astronomical top 5 fantasy scoring quarterback territory. And maybe we overvalued Calvin Ridley just a little bit. And obviously I love Calvin Ridley. I think he has a ton of upside, but he might be one of those players that he hadn't played football in a long time. Not even a spring chicken. He had come off of some injuries there. Maybe we overestimated what Calvin Ridley would do for this offense for Trevor Lawrence. And then of course you add in the injuries that he had to overcome and play throughout this season. I don't think we've seen Trevor Lawrence's ceiling just yet. And I do think he's going to have as many opportunities as anybody to, reach that ceiling eventually.
Okay, real quick on that, if I could. A lot of people thought Ridley was comparable to A.J. Brown to the Eagles, Tyreek to the Dolphins. we may have overshot that quite a bit.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I think we did. And you know what? Like for a free agency class right now that is loaded at wide receiver, I mean, I'm sure there are going to be plenty of franchise tags assessed here in the coming year with the kind of names we're seeing hit the market. But I mean, if you take Calvin Ridley and you upgrade at wide receiver, I'd love to see a guy like Mike Evans or something go to but Mike Evans, I feel like is the kind of player that you'd love to see go to the Jaguars to really give Trevor Lawrence a chance. And with the guys hitting free agency this year, I don't think a big high quality name heading to Jacksonville is really out of the realm of possibilities.
And don't forget that Zay Jones missed a ton of time, especially early on in the season. Then by the time he got healthy, Christian Kirk missed the final 6 weeks of the season with a groin injury. So they just really never had their full allotment of weapons, and it showed, especially once Trevor Lawrence got a little bit banged up. But Matt, one of the things I wanted to ask you is if you are considering this trade, you have to have a lot of conviction about one of these players potentially being an upgrade over Trevor Lawrence. Is one of the top 3 quarterbacks, probably not Caleb Williams because he's going to go high.
As I said,
but, but does Jaden Daniels or Drake May give you enough upside to make this move?
No, and that's not a knock on them. It's just, I just think Lawrence is still really, really good. And if Lawrence brought nothing with his legs, I would consider it. But he's a very good runner, and I think him and May are probably going to be comparable in rushing production, where Daniels is going to exceed that, I'm sure. But I don't know that Daniels is going to be rookie year Lamar in terms of a runner. And I do think all those situations, probably Washington and New England in particular, aren't super fantasy friendly right off the bat.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask you. Will some of this depend on the landing spot? Because let's say Drake May slides a little bit and he goes to Atlanta and he's playing with Drake London and Bijan and Pitts. Does that at least make you think twice about it?
Yeah, Atlanta was the one thing I was thinking of, is if they're going to be really aggressive and go get a quarterback, moving up to 2, moving up to 3, or May falls to 5 and they grab him, that would be attractive. But I still think I want the bird in the hand with Lawrence. I just think Lawrence is being undervalued right now, and that he is still a potential NFL superstar.
Lawrence finished as the quarterback 12 this year in fantasy. Now you look at his points per game production, a little bit lower, quarterback 17. But I will say, I think in the post Urban Meyer era, that is the absolute lowest floor for Trevor Lawrence that we're going to see throughout his career. And again, that was while he was not healthy. Obviously, plenty of questions. Didn't have Christian Kirk at the end of this year. You mentioned Zay Jones. I think there were so many instances contributing to that. And again, I think I have to imagine that is as low as the floor is going to get for Trevor Lawrence.
All right, let's talk about some dream landing spots for the top free agents in this year's class. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience is what brings home the winning trophy. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance, from superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has got you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time, or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber and not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to turn your car into the MVP and bring home that win. Keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Welcome back to the Locked On Dynasty Football Podcast. We are here with Matt Williamson answering your Twitter questions. And this final one is a fun one. Matt, which free agent would be like a dream landing spot for you that would just completely change his value and maybe the value of all the other players around him?
We've talked about it a lot, but my answer to this going into the show was Kirk Cousins or some sort of stable quarterback in Atlanta. Yeah, I mean,
that's mine as well. That's great.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like low hanging fruit. I know
That
you're
is
into
low-hanging
London.
fruit, both of you.
Yeah,
Shame.
it is.
Shame.
I have a lot of pit stock. I have a fair amount of London. I have a fair amount of Bijan. And I really just think a quarterback that can complete passes there would go a very long way. Another low-hanging fruit coming off the Super Bowl is any receiver that gets to Kansas City. Yeah, it would be tremendous. And I do think, Peacock and I were talking about this yesterday. I do think you're going to start seeing free agents take 75, 80 cents on the dollar to go play with Mahomes. So they may be able to get more than you think in the buying market.
Okay, what about you?
Okay, so first, I do have to say I have a different answer for this that might at least give some variance to the discussions, because of course everybody wants to see a guy like Kirk Cousins who can actually deliver an accurate football to this cast and characters in Atlanta, and I get it. I want to ask you guys one question before we actually get into my answer, though. And for Kirk Cousins fantasy value, I'm curious because I actually, as somebody who has a ton of Kirk Cousins dynasty shares, and as somebody who thinks Kirk Cousins generally very underrated in dynasty, coming off an Achilles injury, obviously is a little bit on the older side, but it's not like the run is a staple of Kirk Cousins' game. He has a statue in the pocket to begin with. So I'm just going to throw the Achilles injury out the window here. When I'm looking at the dynasty value of my Kirk Cousins shares, I want him to go back to Minnesota because I'm going to actually make the argument here that him going to Atlanta is a downgrade in his weaponry. And for as many, Drake London, Kyle Pitts shares as I have, do you guys not agree that for Kirk Cousins value specifically that Atlanta would be a downgrade?
I think for Cousins specifically, if you own Cousins, you want him to go back to Minnesota no matter what. Again, it's kind of the bird in the hand situation. He's extremely familiar with the head coach. They seem to have a very good relationship. It's an offensive-minded play-calling head coach. Probably the best receiver in the league, oh, by the way. Addison's a good young player, and Hawkinson. So, and they don't have a running game. I'm not sure you can come up with a better situation. I definitely think you want Cousins to return, let alone Atlanta or anywhere else.
Okay, I'm happy to hear that because I feel, am I the only person in the world that rosters Kirk Cousins in Dynasty? Because I have him everywhere. And I feel like nobody's talked about the flip side of Kirk Cousins leaving and going to a place like Atlanta, which again, from a football standpoint, you'd love to see it. But again, from my perspective, okay. Now I'm going to segue into my dream free agency spot for free agency. I'm going to say DeAndre Swift heading to the Los Angeles Chargers, playing with Jim Harbaugh, Greg Roman, who's returning as offensive coordinator. I want to take a look back. Let's look at what San Francisco produced with Jim Harbaugh, with Greg Roman. You know what that offense looked like? It was a run-heavy Frank Gore show. Top 3 in rush attempts in 2 of their 4 seasons together. Never ranked lower than 9th in total rush attempts. You have DeAndre Swift, who I think has relatively fresh legs, coming off a really solid season, ranked 5th in rushing yards this year, 12th in rush attempts, RB24 in fantasy points per game. And I think a lot of that low ceiling comes from the fact that you had Jalen Hurts in the tush push dominating those red zone touches, had just 5 rushing touchdowns. You put DeAndre Swift in this LA Chargers offense in a scheme that I think is going to be very friendly toward the run, despite the fact that Justin Herbert is there and thriving. And you obviously have to make him a focal point of things as well. But I think DeAndre Swift in this offense could do some serious, serious damage. I don't think Austin Eckler wants to come back to the LA Chargers, which also means, for all those targets he's vacating as well, in addition to those rush attempts, DeAndre Swift might actually become the fantasy asset we drafted him to be all those years ago.
Matt, thoughts?
I love it. I absolutely love it. Any back to Harbaugh would be great. Swift is the perfect one for me because I think there's still a lot there. And I don't mean to one-up you, but I've heard this might have some legs. What about Saquon to the Texans?
See, that's really funny that you mentioned that, because I was going to go Tony Pollard to the Texans. The Texans had some luck with 2 former Cowboys last year. in Dalton Schultz and Noah Brown. Why not bring Tony Pollard? We saw Devin Singletary, who I like as a player. He had 1,100 yards and 4 touchdowns as like a backup in the first half of the year. Why not go out and get Tony Pollard, bring some more speed to your offense? They had,
and then
so
Derrick
many,
Henry to your Cowboys after that.
I think I'm good. I think it's time for Dallas to like not spend some money on some running backs. But like, could I see Tony Pollard being a 1,500 yard back in Houston and scoring 12 or 13 touchdowns? Absolutely. And I don't think it's going to cost the Texans a bunch to go out and get him. I think that's the type of player that they could go out and spend and that would actually make their offense even more dangerous this season.
Mm-hmm. No, I
now
agree.
This is the kind of creativity I wanted to see from you guys. Come on.
Not Kirk Cousins to the Falcons. Yeah.
No, yeah. This is the kind of juice we needed to see. And speaking of juice, I mean, that Tony Pollard, like I do think whatever team lands him in free agency, they're going to get him at a discount because of the tough season that he had. There was a report today that said, Tony Pollard didn't actually feel like 100% back until like week 11 or something from his lower body injury. And I do think that played a huge part. And a guy who's, the primary aspect of his game is that explosive playmaking ability. And yeah, coming off a lower body injury, I have to imagine that played a huge part in things.
Kate, from week 11 on, Tony Pollard was PFF's #1 graded running back. So
Really?
I think that matches up from what we saw in the film. So if the Texans can get a high quality running back at a pretty cheap price, I'm all in. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Dynasty your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. Go download the podcast wherever you get your podcasts. We are free and available on all platforms. Go follow Matt on Twitter at Williamson NFL. Follow Kate at Kate Modjuk. I'm at Marcus _Mosher, and we will see you right back here tomorrow.